Oh my god, I'm a genius. Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of Business Blaze. This one is possibly one of the most requested things that you guys have asked for. It's all about the Pepsi Navy. I know absolutely nothing about this other than people in the comments were like, were you aware, Simon, the Pepsi once had the biggest navy or like one of the biggest navies in the world? And I was like, wow, I don't care. Not really. Then I was like, Danny, go write me a script. And that's what happened. Danny wrote the script, I record this video, Sam adds some memes, and let's get into it. Sam is not over there. I don't know why I'm looking over there. I like to pretend he is. For the longest time when this channel first started, people were like, is Danny there with you? Why doesn't he ever say anything? I'm like, Danny is not there with me. France, the UK, Japan, China, Russia, the United States. I'm gonna guess we're talking about the world's biggest navies. That's probably the rough order in which I would put the 6 nations most likely to put together a strong, crazy golf team. Should it ever be recognized as an Olympic event? Well, I guess I was wrong. Thanks, Danny, you really cleared that up. By an almost staggering coincidence, it's also the exact same order in which we might place the owners of the most powerful naval forces in the world. Ba-da-bum-bum! For outside bets a bit further down the anchor chain, ba-da-bum-bum! We might also go with choices such as India, South Korea, Italy, and Taiwan. Surely, only a completely clueless imbecile would go with a name like, say, Pepsi. It's not even a country, Danny! Mainly because PepsiCo isn't widely considered to be an independent sovereign state, I should read these ahead of time, or any of the hundreds of other very loose and ambiguous definitions of a country or nation. All they do is sell cans of nice, fizzy pop. Which is a very American thing to write, Danny, because I don't think we call it fizzy pop unless you do from where you're from. I'd call it a soft drink. But if legend is to be believed, for a very brief moment in time, the makers of Pepsi Cola were once recognized as the 6th most powerful navy in the world. That use of legend there is obviously legendary, but it also makes me think that maybe this story is not true. And I've asked Danny to write an entire 10-ish page script on something that might not even be real. Very few people seem willing to remember just how dramatically the Cola Wars escalated in the late 1980s and 1990s. Oh, Pepsi's gonna nuke Coke. The epic battle for cola syrup supremacy eventually hit the waves of the ocean as Pepsi engaged in a dramatic battle with their arch rivals Coca-Cola, who only had the 9th biggest navy force in the world at the time, but they did have a much bigger fleet of F-15E Strike Eagles. This is definitely not true. During the short but brutal conflict, thousands of lives were lost, an inflatable dinghy got a puncture, and a swan pedalo was wrecked beyond repair. I like pedalos. They're one of life's joys. You know, they're those little boats that you get to ride on like a river or a small lake or something and pedal with your feet. I find that, even as an adult man, surprisingly enjoyable. I recently decided that this summer I'm gonna buy a kayak. I'm gonna go kayaking. I haven't kayaked since I was a teenager, and I used to like it. I'm gonna go kayaking in some rivers. Hopefully I won't drown. If I don't come back to Business Blaze, it's because I drowned. Either that or I died from coke. Of course, none of the last bit was remotely true. Oh, Danny, come on. Everyone knows we're here. In fact, no one's here for facts, because I just conducted a poll on YouTube, which many of you have probably seen by now, asking like why you watch Business Blaze. As of the time of recording this, not a single has said they watch for the business stories. Everyone watches for the blaze. But surely it's just as believable as Pepsi ever being officially recognized as a military force of any kind. That would just be utterly ridiculous. So, did the Pepsi Navy ever exist? And did the story of the fizzy pop sailors really begin with a simple plastic cup of Pepsi helping to defuse a punch-up between American and Russian leaders? What is going on? Strap on a pair of inflatable crab-shaped armbands as we dive into this unlikely tale and try to untangle the fact from the fiction. We're only 5 minutes in. I was just watching a video on how to be successful on YouTube because, you know, always learning, and they were like, the most successful videos are ones where they're short and get immediately to the point, and I was like, oh, fuck. Relations between the US and the Soviet Union had grown more than a little frosty following the Second World War. Yeah, Danny, it was called the Cold War. It was kind of a big deal. But there were a few signs of a thaw following the death of Joseph Stalin in 1953, which led to an agreement to increase cultural contact and to host showcase exhibitions in each other's nations. So, the Soviet National Exhibition landed in New York City in 1959, and everyone was persuaded to become a communist. Not really. It showed off examples of Soviet industry, agriculture, theatrical performances, and lots of cool stuff about the Sputnik. Not all US visitors were that impressed, though. The Soviets had thoughtfully provided comment books around the exhibition so that visitors could leave their feedback. Wow, that's really not communist, like asking people what they think. It's a shame they didn't do that back home with their nation. How do you feel about this guy being the leader? Too bad.
This is a briefing. I'm not seeking your consent.
The books were destined to get filled with vulgar abuse and sarcastic remarks, such as, I think the main perspective of this Russian exhibit is to show the average American citizen how he is lucky to be an American. Americans probably didn't bother. It's like, here, we present to you the amazing Lada. It is best car. It is best car, no doubt about being best car. Everyone's like, it's a bit of a piece of shit, isn't it? I still see Ladas on the road sometimes, and you're like, really? You saw what the Germans were making around the same time, right? I mean, the West Germans. Spoiler alert, their stuff wasn't shit and still exists today. Maybe Lada still makes cars today, but let's just say they don't have a brilliant international presence. The Americans probably didn't bother with the comment books when they returned the favor later that same year and brought the American National Exhibit to Sokolniki Park in Moscow. It's kind of ironic, the Americans were the one who didn't seek feedback from the audience. President Eisenhower was determined to get Soviet citizens to appreciate the glorious benefits of US capitalism over Soviet communism, and so the idea was to flood the exhibition with sponsored booths from a long list of very familiar US brands, showing off their wares for trade. So, for the very first time, the Soviet Union was introduced to the concept of things like Disney, IBM, and the Dixie Cup. Are Dixie Cups those solo cups? What the is a Dixie Cup? I assume it's something super American that I don't know. But also, I made a video on my Top 10s channel about, those red cups and blue cups that you see at, like, I don't know, I see them in every American movie that features fraternities or college. And we don't have those. Those I've never seen, I've never used one of those in my life. But apparently they are just a staple of the college experience in the US. And perhaps most significantly of all, Pepsi Cola. When are we talking about the Navy, Danny? What is going on? I'm learning about communism. Again. Comrade, come on! Eisenhower was too busy to attend the opening of the exhibition himself, so he sent along Vice President, you might know him, Richard Nixon, to hobnob with Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev at the event. But it's perhaps not too surprising that the Vice President of capitalist America and the leader of Soviet communism ended up trading verbal punches with each other when they got around to talking. Things got pretty intense. Even be awesome to see a fight between Richard Nixon and Khrushchev. Things are pretty intense, even if they were conducting their fierce arguments through an interpreter, which I always find brings a slightly clumsy edge to a heated debate. Stick where the sun don't shine. We do not have exact phrase like this in Russian. I say he insert into bottom sun. Russia's love affair with Pepsi Cola can be largely traced back to an iconic black and white photograph taken at the exhibition launch, which I hope Sam can throw up onto the screen about now. Do the honors, Sam! Do the honors, Sam! Put it right here! The photograph depicts Richard Nixon standing beside Nikita Khrushchev, who is taking his very first sip of Pepsi from a plastic cup that has just been handed to him by Pepsi's Vice President of Marketing, Donald Kendall. This sounds like, I'm all for capitalism, but if I was the Russians, I'd be like, wow, capitalism has really taken over. Like, these guys get to, have such an important influence? That doesn't seem right. Don't get any ideas. Don't smash that dislike button just yet, because look, if we had communism over here and capitalism over here, I'm probably here. Let's, like I say, let's just be capitalists, but not be pieces of shit. Because, well, communism just doesn't work and sucks. Socialism too. Don't get any ideas. Smash that dislike button. And don't think that doesn't mean that I don't like having free healthcare. It does. I think healthcare should be free. So maybe I'm here. This is said to be the photograph that helped put Pepsi on the Russian map. But there are differing stories as to how the photograph came about. Most online sources claim that Nixon and Khrushchev had got embroiled in such a big slagging match that Khrushchev had started profusely swearing in blind rage. The legend goes that Pepsi saved the day when Donald Kendall intervened and offered Khrushchev a cold drink in a bid to try and cool down the Soviet leader in the fiery argument. No, Mr. Kendall, that sounds like your PR spin. Or, something that you're literally making to an advert with actors playing Nixon and Khrushchev, because that didn't happen, did it? However, like certain other parts of the Pepsi Navy story, the truth had probably got a little more distorted and mashed up with other related incidents. It's true that Nixon and Khrushchev did get involved in some blazing debates at the exhibition. These were actually televised in both countries and became known as the kitchen debates because a lot of the verbal sparring took place in the model kitchen of a suburban display home on show at the exhibition. But I feel like I've heard of this. But the Pepsi moment didn't really have anything to do with this, and it was in fact a stunt that had been cunningly planned by Donald Kendall all along. What a Surprise, anyone who didn't see through this is an idiot. Pepsi's vice president of marketing had actually defied the wishes of his superiors by sponsoring a booth and attending the exhibition, where he just sneaked off to Russia during the Cold War. So that sounds easy. The company had felt that there was little realistic chance of turning the Soviets onto fizzy cola. Determined to fizzy cola is good, like communist or no, it tastes pretty good, and I know Coca-Cola is like the ultimate sign of capitalism.
When you drink Coca-Cola, you're from fucking America.
Determined to prove to his superiors that he had made the right call, he met up with Nixon the night before the launch and told him that it was his mission to get a Pepsi in Khrushchev's hands. They conspired together to ensure that a photographer would be waiting in perfect position to capture them meticulously rehearsed moments of Kendall spontaneously handing Khrushchev his very first taste of the drink. It'd be funny if Khrushchev was like, "Nein!" Wait, that's German. Niet! And it worked like a charm. The snapshot went viral, like Cold War viral, or at least as viral as you could get in 1959. Yeah, it wasn't a TikTok sensation, was it, Danny? Having said all that, Russia had to wait. I realize I'm roaming a lot while I blaze today, and when I get further back, it gets pretty dark. So I apologize for that ahead of time. I can go really it is bright and hot. I gotta replace these lights with like LED lights because they're less bright and horrible. I mean hot and horrible. Having said that, Russia had to wait a long time before glass bottles of Pepsi finally hit the shelves. Also, why is it that Coke and also Pepsi, but mostly Coke, taste so good out of a glass bottle, like compared to a can? Like, I mean, everyone knows that I feel like, unlike the Back to the Future movies, where people disagree that the second one is best, incorrectly, but everyone knows that the rankings of Coca-Cola is like large plastic bottle is the worst, small plastic bottle is slightly better, can is better than that, and then glass bottle is just the superior way of consuming it. And then SodaStream Coca-Cola, like out of the whatever you call it, you know, when you and it, like in McDonald's or whatever, is like somewhere over here because it depends on my mood. By the time we get to the 1970s, Nikita Khrushchev had long been removed from power before his death from a heart attack in 1971. In contrast, two of the other key players had risen to the top in a rush of fizzy bubbles. Richard Nixon was now president of the US, but far more importantly than that, Donald Kendall had become CEO of Pepsi. That's what's more important. Donald Kendall. The Soviet Union was now crying out for Pepsi, but a deal was going to be tricky to negotiate. We're sick of these larders and whatever communist Pepsi is.
You're from fucking America.
The problem was the Soviet ruble had no international worth whatsoever, as its value was determined by the Kremlin, and Soviet law prohibited taking the currency abroad. That's going to be tricky for international trade. So Pepsi and the Soviet Union had to resort to a bit of bartering. And it's no surprise that gallons and gallons of lovely Russian vodka entered the equation at this point as an alternative form of universal currency. That's pretty clever. Most brands of vodka were owned by the Soviet state, including a brand first established in 1901 called Stolichnaya, which just happened to be very popular in the US too. Never heard of it. Don't really drink vodka. So a deal was struck in which Pepsi would ship its soft drink syrup to the Soviet Union, where it would be made into Coca-Cola, where it would be made into cola and bottled locally. In return, large supplies of this vodka would be sent to Pepsi to distribute in the US, making the company's first venture into the alcoholic beverages market. Oh, and there was also a side order of tomato paste. A few years later, PepsiCo would acquire the Pizza Hut chain, and so they were happy to get their hands on some Soviet tomato paste for spreading across the pizzas in Western Europe. Is that true? That's bizarre. I mean, I guess that's how international trade works. It's weird. It was a pretty historic agreement, I guess. Pepsi had now become the very first Western product to be sold in the Soviet Union, or as... Jesus Christ, scare the out of me. We're back. Apparently I decided to set my phone to the terrifyingly loud setting. Pepsi had now become the very first Western product to be sold in the Soviet Union, or as the New York Times phrased it, the first capitalist product to be sold in the USSR. Fascinating. Kendall had negotiated a cola monopoly which locked out Coca-Cola from the Soviet Union until 1985.
When you drink Coca-Cola, you're from fucking America.
And Pepsi quickly became the dominant soft drink in the Soviet Union, shifting over 1 billion units every year. That's a lot of Coca-Cola. Although, let's say 100 million people lived in Russia at the time. I have no idea. Maybe it's 200 million, 100 million, whatever. They're only buying 10 Cokes a year or 10 Pepsis a year. It's not that many. As we roll into the 1980s, it seems that the Soviet Union's thirst for Pepsi just couldn't be quenched. A plan was formed to double the number of Pepsi plants in the Soviet Union and begin distributing the drink in aluminium cans and plastic bottles for the first time, rather than the cumbersome glass bottles which had been exclusively used up until this point. But this was going to be very expensive and would require a bit more from the Soviet Union than just vodka and tomato paste. Which, by the way, makes a great cocktail when you find yourself short on ginger beer. Vodka and tomato juice. Yeah, like a Bloody Mary. Although tomato paste and vodka sounds like a bit of a, like, desperate Bloody Mary. It's like, oh yeah, we didn't have tomato juice, so I used tomato ketchup. You homeless motherfucker. So we don't discriminate against homeless people. However, the Soviet Union, I'm not discriminating against homeless people, I'm discriminating against people who drink vodka and tomato ketchup. However, the Soviet Union had a cunning idea. They still had loads of old naval vessels left over from the Cold War. We're 5 pages in, and we're finally getting to the trade. Or whatever, how they got the vessels.
75 years later.
And so they made an unusual proposal to Pepsi. In return for about $3 billion worth of Pepsi Cola, the Soviet Union would hand over a fleet of warships, which was considered to be the 6th largest naval force in the world at the time. The juicy package included 17 submarines, a frigate, a cruiser, and a destroyer, but sadly, no sign of a Swan Pedalo. Danny and I are on the same page about Pedalos. What a glorious experience. Also, at one point, I think Pepsi gave away a Harrier jump jet. I made a video about it, or they didn't really, because then the lawyers got involved. They were like, nah, it was a puff. We've talked about puffs before. If you know what a puff is, well, you OG Business Plays legend. Now, Pepsi was initially a little bit bewildered about this proposed deal, largely because they weren't sure what the f they were expected to do with this crazy Russian naval shit. They sold fizzy drinks. Becoming the 6th most powerful naval force in the world was never really a part of the business plan. Take over some countries and force them to sell Pepsi. It's like the only way you can beat Coke. But when they discovered the value of the fleet, they apparently grew more interested in the idea of becoming the middleman in a deal which would ultimately involve selling off the vessels to a third party who might be able to find something useful to do with them. It'd be funny, yeah, we sold them to Gaddafi. So legend has it that for a very brief time in 1989, the Pepsi Navy sailed into the history books. US national security were reportedly a little unhappy with the idea of the cola manufacturer becoming a powerful naval force, but I'd imagine they'd just be happy to get the vessels out of the hands of the Soviets. But Donald Kendall was quick to defend the trade. He responded with, "I'm dismantling the Soviet Union faster than you are." That is brilliant. Don and I on the same page. And that is quite the line. His line is way better than mine. However, it seems that Pepsi was never really tempted to unleash the monstrous power of their warships on Coca-Cola. Well, of course they weren't, because that would be massively illegal. It's reported that it would be... What happened to Coca-Cola? Pepsi wiped him out. Literally. Like, literally destroyed them. It's like that. What's that museum in Atlanta? They just nuked Atlanta. It's reported that within just a few days, the vessels had been sold onto a company in Sweden for scrap. Just as quickly as the Pepsi Navy had sailed onto the scene, the vessels had embarked upon their final voyage to the junkyard over the horizon. What horizon, Danny? Everyone knows that the world is flat. How do the people who think the world is flat reconcile that with the horizon? I don't understand. You just look at the horizon and you're like, oh yeah, well I guess the world is round. Who looks at it and be like, what? It doesn't go on forever. I can see it several miles into the distance. What happened to that ship that went over the horizon, flat earth people? You absolute... don't make fun of flat earth people, Simon. No, I'm good with that. They're dumb. They are fucking dumb. Smash that dislike button. Did any of this really ever happen? Everyone in the comments told me it happened, so I don't know. Despite the story of the Pepsi Navy getting widely reported as fact by usually faintly reliable sources such as Wikipedia, the BBC, the New York Times, and the Jolly Fisherman's wacky naval blog, I have to cast some doubt on whether this actually happened in the way it's often described. What? The media were wrong? Who would have thought it? Any time that I've ever read the media on myself, like, my favorite recent one was like when that Top 10s channel got hacked. It was like, yeah, we reached out. I read some article on some cryptocurrency blog. It was like, we didn't get a comment from Top 10s. I'm like, you didn't ask! It's as if I'm like keeping my lips sealed about something. It makes it look negative. And I'm like, yeah, they didn't comment. And I'm like, you didn't ask me for comment. I got no email from you. I don't know who you are. I also don't care. But don't make me look like a dick. What did I do to you? It certainly looks as if the deal was proposed in 1989, hence Kendall's genuine quote on the matter about dismantling the Soviet Union. But there doesn't appear to be any official record of any trades of naval equipment between the Soviet Union, Pepsi, or the mysterious unnamed Swedish scrap company. Here's the thing. 1 year later in 1990, Pepsi did indeed broker a deal of $3 billion with the Soviet Union to help double the production of cola syrup in the USSR. Okay, so the deal is the same value, but that's a completely different deal. But this complicated deal involved the trading of non-naval freighters and tankers from the Soviet Union alongside the usual mix of vodka and tomato paste. What is going on? Very little of this was reported in the media at the time. What? The media didn't pick up on the actual story and instead reported something else that they found more interesting but factually incorrect? Weird. But what appears to have happened is that many years later, journalists and media outlets and bloggers have looked back at the mashed these two stories together, coming to the misjudged conclusion that the original 1989 proposal was the one that went ahead in the 1990s. It's more accurate to say that Pepsi did buy some ships from the Soviet Union at one point, but they very probably weren't naval ships, and in any far-fetched scenario, Pepsi could never truly be considered to have been the owner of the sixth biggest naval force in the world anyway. Sadly, it seems as if the Pepsi Navy may never have really existed at all. In fact, now what am I going to title this video, Danny? Now I can't do the clickbait, can I? Because people are clickbait, Pepsi didn't have a navy. So I'll have to be like, Pepsi didn't have a navy, and then no one will click on this video and no one will ever watch it. But honest Simon might do the right thing. You already know whether I did or not. In fairness, I did say the right thing at the beginning, as such an idea would have been utterly ridiculous. Still, at least we've learned the story of how Pepsi conquered Russia, and you've hopefully learned that Business Blaze digs a little deeper than Wikipedia, the BBC, and the New York Times put together. That's right. Business Blaze on the bleeding edge. Although no one would mistake this for journalism. So, we shouldn't be too disheartened that the Pepsi Navy was largely just made up of ghost pirates. I bet the uniforms would have been rubbish anyway. Bada boom boom. Someone told me an amazing story in the comments that they were in a meeting, a Zoom meeting because it's still the virus time, with their boss. And like other employees, and they actually made like the extended rim shot. Because I know it's I didn't know it at first, but now I do. And they went boom, like to someone's joke in this meeting. And someone responded, "That's not how you do that." To which his boss replied, "Allegedly." And I'm like, how does that work? Business Blaze has like 100,000 subscribers, but it has cultural penetration. That was epic and possibly the coolest thing I've ever read. Bonus fact. I'm sure many of us will remember the Pepsi Challenge marketing campaigns, which have been running in one form or another since the 1970s. In the commercials I used to watch on TV as a kid, a blind taste test was usually set up in a shopping mall or somewhere similar. Ordinary members of the public were invited to take a single sip from two plain white cups, one containing Pepsi and one containing Coca-Cola, and then encouraged to reveal what drink they preferred. The results were always heavily in favor of Pepsi, which is a good job really, otherwise it would have been a truly terrible marketing campaign. Yeah, they'd just never have published it. But it also sounds like a very odd result, because the truth is that while the cola wars had battled on over the decades, Coca-Cola was usually way out in front. So why are more people buying Coke when they seem to prefer Pepsi? I believe, because I think I've done a video about this before, all of this knowledge is just loosely in my mind somewhere. One day I think I'm gonna have to go on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire and get rich. Although then they'll ask me a question about sports and I'll be like, shit, I just like, whenever I'm doing a Today I Found Out video about baseball, I'm like, I don't know what I read. I'll be like reading the teleprompter just absolutely phased out. Like, I couldn't tell you what that was about. Like, somehow I manage. Skills. You could obviously, oh yeah, so my point was I think it had something to do with them only being small portions, and Pepsi was sweeter, so in a smaller portion, people prefer the sweetness, but then as they have more Pepsi, it's like, it's too sweet. I prefer Coca-Cola. Also, Coca-Cola is already goddamn sweet. The answer is more likely to boil down to a question of sweetness. God damn it, I was right. Pepsi is a little sweeter than Coke, and research has shown that most people tend to prefer a sweeter taste on their first sip of two different beverages. But the same research also shows that more people generally prefer a less sweet taste over the whole can. Oh my god, I'm a genius. Also because I read that in the past and remembered it. So I'm not a genius, I've just got an okay memory. So we can conclude from this that Coke is the favored choice for thirsty consumers who fancy finishing off the whole can, but if you're just after a tiny sip, Pepsi all the way. But no one is, and that's why Coca-Cola is king. Allegedly. Thank you for watching this episode of Business Blaze, you legends, if you watched to the end. Even if you hate watched, which was another option that I included on my poll, well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. It's all about the sweet watch time. Thanks again. See you next time. We do not have exact phrase like this in Russian. I say he insult into bottom sun.